William Carlos Williams wrote in a poem called January Morning that I've discovered that most of the beauties of travel are due to the strange hours we keep to see them. And many of you experienced that same reverie that William Carlos Williams felt. And what I realized is I think traveling's a little bit like making art because you're taking things in a new way because you're seeing it for the first time. So I won't take you from Bangor to Detroit to Minneapolis to Lincoln. I'll just take you after the plane landed in Lincoln. So the first thing I see, it's a very nice airport, and all the flights are canceled for the next day. And then driving out of the long approach to the airport, we turn right, and there with a big sign it says, Dr. John's Lingerie and Novelties open 24 hours. And this is about like at 11 at night, so it's just kind of it's just there. And then I just a state trooper stopping somebody, little bits of snow, because this was the day before the big snow, just little, looks like styrofoam along the road, and then the enormous stadium, like a religious icon of the, and then you go to sleep, and the next day I wake to horizontal snow, which is exquisitely beautiful. So all those odd elements, and maybe for me they'll become a poem someday. But so in a way, traveling can slow you down, but to me it's also easiest when you travel to see that the world is moving too fast. The wait in between flights hasn't sped up, and security screening slows us down, but I'm talking about the speed with which we handle information and the speed with which we pass through our own lives. Everyone is in a hurry to get to the next thing. People walking with cell phones attached to their ears. You know that look? That's a very odd one for me, coming from Deer Isle where we don't have cell phone coverage. But they're walking with purpose down corridors of the airports. We get our coffees to go and keep on walking or driving on to the next thing. Sometimes when I travel, I want to make sure to make eye contact with the cashier at the newsstand who may be just as eager to move on to ringing up the next purchase. But for me, it's my way of saying, here we are humans, we have a moment in time, and that moment is now. I'm as guilty as the next person of speeding from thing to thing, crisis to crisis. I'll finish one job and scratch it off my list and look for the next one to start. What slows me down is making. When I'm writing, the world moves more slowly. I can move between adjectives and noun, consider a metaphor, and time takes on a different character. I'm not concerned with the clock or where I have to get to or what I've done and haven't done. It's as close as I can get to being in time and in the moment I'm breathing. Being makers ties us to the world. It binds us to the time we are working and to the materials that we are working with as well. I love to watch people who work at their art in their studios, and as Michael said, those studios are open 24 hours a day at Haystack, so I've had 18 years to observe the insanity and chaos of art making, I guess. But the way that they spread out with their workspaces and they have fragments tacked to the wall, and always at some point there's a profusion of materials and ideas until, if we're paying attention and not forcing the issue too much, a pattern, an order, a harmony will emerge. We have to move through the chaos and confusion first. It's a necessary part of the process. While I work mostly with words, I've spent a lot of time watching people work with materials, watch them enter into a world where ideas transform materials and materials transform ideas. For me, watching people at work in the studio is both seeing an artistic process at work and also seeing an archetype of humans as makers, seekers, and transformers. What always impresses me when I'm watching people who make things is how ingenious humans are at adapting, figuring things out, making do, and solving problems, which you did just to get here, I think. I live on a small island. Michael showed one part of the island. Deer Isle is about the size of Manhattan. There are 3,000 people who live on it, so it's a little less populated than Manhattan. But I find that living there, that ingenuity informs every day. Lobstermen improvise because every day can be different on the water. Every weather condition can change, so you have to figure things out. And it's not just the fishermen, it's women who quilt and sew and arrange for care for someone in distress. It's plumbers who improvise ways to thaw out frozen drain pipes in sub-zero temperatures. That was a recent experience for me. It's women picking out crab meat so efficiently with no wasted motion. It's an auto mechanic who can figure out a way to improvise with an old part to make sure your car passes inspection another year. It's all around us, this ingenuity, how we adapt and survive. Now, I didn't grow up on Deer Isle. I actually grew up in the state of New Jersey. telling you that right now, just as a kind of confession, I guess. But perhaps because I came to the island later in life, it's also a place that I realized about ingenuity really being part of a community, and that the community's survival is based on everyone figuring things out. On Deer Isle, everybody waves to everybody in their cars because people kind of recognize each other. So it's not a big wave. It's not like you'd never do this because that would be emotionally too revealing. Just enough to lift your fingers off the steering wheel. Maybe a relative, you might get 3 fingers, 1 finger. It depends. But I just love that way when I'm out for a walk, that you realize everybody is a part of the metaphorical fabric of that community, and people recognize it. And basketball seems to be a religion in Nebraska, I noticed. It's also a religion in Maine, and the Deer Isle Stonington High School boys are playing tomorrow in the state championship, but they won the Eastern Maine Championship, and 174 cars met them at the bridge to the island for a Around the Island parade. 174 cars and 10 fire engines to parade around the island, where people would flick their lights off, on and off. Anyhow, it's given me a wonderful sense of community, and that community informs how I look everywhere I travel. And it's not just the small islands, but islands in Manhattan as well. And what ingenious men and women have made it possible for us to exist side by side, to have shelter, to be sustained by food, to live our lives together. We may often complain about what doesn't work, but what we have built, we've made a built world from experimentation and the materials around us is astounding. What everyone who works with materials knows, too, is that ingenuity isn't mastery, it's partnership. When you're at work, you have to learn to listen to the material that you're working with. For the last year, my wife and I have been renovating a big old former boarding house. Somebody called it a Victorian money sponge to me yesterday. I chose not to listen, but it's allowed us to observe a lot of people in the building trades coming up with ingenious solutions. Once you begin to dismantle parts of an old house, you may find histories and mysteries that don't lend themselves to ready-made solutions. Last fall, we realized that we needed to improve the drainage around the foundation of our house, which is about 150 years old. And Rick Weed, who operates heavy equipment and has such a light touch, legend has it, can take something out of your pocket with the bucket of his backhoe. Excavated a 10-foot-long section of our foundation. He'd expected to find a stone wall built of large glacial boulders that needed to be repointed, remortared. And after that, Dan Foss, our mason, would come in and mortar that, and then we'd put the dirt back up against it to stop water from flowing into the basement. But when Rick dug the earth away, he realized that there actually was no mortar on those outside stones, and if we cleaned the dirt off, we'd actually just start to take apart the wall. So that was plan A, and plan A was gone at that point. And what happened next was informative to me, both in how we solve problems and how we work in partnership. In some instances, somebody might begin to suggest the answer right away, perhaps because it was in Maine, or perhaps because these two men were used to moving big and heavy objects. They had a different sense of pacing. The first thing they did was to just look at the hole. No one said anything, and they spent a while taking it in. Next, Rick, whose idea it had been to excavate, asked Dan to help him solve the problem. Dan's solution was to leave the wall undisturbed and put crushed stone against it that would allow the water to drain away easily. And it was great because they looked for a long time and nobody said anything, and it was so unusual in America to have somebody not have an answer. I mean, we don't have the right answers necessarily, but we'll come up with one. And Dan at that point said, "We've all lived long enough," he said, "to realize not everything is perfect, but it can work." And that was plan B, and Rick embraced it as well. And I appreciated that at that moment, both of them understood materials, and they both realized that they were solving a problem, not trying to outdo each other with their solutions, but to listen to the house in a way and to do what made most sense. When I see people working in this way, I feel myself in touch with a much older way of looking at the world. Humans have been making things for tens of thousands of years. The technology that we have developed, from the computer that I typed this on, to the plane that brought us here after a while, to the watch on my wrist that keeps track of time, to the clothing I wear, our ingenuity has made our survival possible. A few years ago, at Haystack, we had a symposium in conjunction with the Massachusetts Institute of Technology Media Lab. You might be familiar with that program. And it was an event called Digital Dialogues, Technology in the Hand. And our aim was to examine the world of new technology, the new digital, and and the old digital and how they work together. We wanted to look at how we make things and the role that the hand can still have in this new world. Our invited audience included artists, craft makers, educators, philosophers, researchers, scientists, and writers. When I visited the Media Lab in Cambridge for our planning sessions, I was taken with the spirit of creativity of the place. It's one big box on the MIT campus. It looks a lot like if you have teenagers or were ever a teenager, it has that look of like a teenager's room, and they play with Legos to figure things out. There are toys all over the place. It's a wonderful kind of chaos, the same way an artist studio looks in a way. But we were two different worlds, one rural and craft and the other urban and high tech. In one of our first planning sessions when we were deciding on the next date to meet, I was the only one who had a paper calendar and everyone else's were electronic. I had no idea what they were doing at first. I just tried not to say a lot, figuring I could get through that moment. But I wrote down the dates and they tapped in the dates and it worked out. And when we discussed who would be invited to this event, it was a 5-day event, half of whom would be people working in digital media. I was worried about how we might all get along together. As part of the design of the symposium, we had organized some of the studios to have a person with a technology background along with a person with a craft background. And these two people would collaborate in some way, and we weren't sure of the outcome and didn't have any expectations, but we knew we wanted a significant part of the symposium to be hands-on so people could really experience working together and get a sense of how they work together or not. And one of the collaborations was between the blacksmith Tom Joyce from Santa Fe, New Mexico. Tom, shortly after that, received a MacArthur Award for his work. And Justine Cassell, who's professor in the Gesture and Narrative Language group at the Media Lab. And Justine has a significant academic background, but it wound up that the first time that when she was in high school, she went to a program at Haystack. Her eyes weren't still glazed, but she had gone on to it in an academic career, but she had worked in jewelry, so she still had that in her mind. And these two were assisted at various times by 4 or 5 others, some blacksmiths and some computer, I guess geek would be the word, working together. And what Tom and Justine created was a forged steel vessel that told the story through audio and video of its own making. As you'd reach inside the vessel, there were sensors, and you could pull out the sound and images of what went into the making of the vessel. And watching this team work together using technologies that ranged from the ancient and mythic fires of the blacksmith to the cool media of the digital camera and LED lights, I was impressed with the tenacity with which everyone worked, from hammering steel to writing computer programs. I began to see not people who were worlds apart, but a continuum of creativity and the remarkable human capacity to solve problems with the tools that are available. Because we've made so many rapid advances in the digital world, we sometimes equate technology with new, but it's really the most ancient of human stories. Artists and makers are part of this continuum of ingenuity and creativity. Here's some synonyms for ingenuity, in case you're ever stuck in a poem and want to use it, from Roget's Thesaurus. Adeptness, adroitness, bent, capability, cleverness, command, competence, craft, they haven't changed that word yet, craft, deftness, expertise, expertness, finesse, flair, genius, gift, handiness, intelligence, knack, know-how, mastery, proficiency, resourcefulness, savvy, skill, skillfulness, strength, talent, the goods, and the stuff. I like that juxtaposition of words. It's almost, for me, a kind of found poem building up to the goods and the stuff. And to expand on the stuff, makers make things, objects, quilts, and vessels, material stuff with which we can fill and overfill our lives. But the stuff can be more transcendent than that. It can be the inner world that gives our lives meaning. Because besides having the ingenuity to ensure our physical survival, what artist makers can do is to ensure our spiritual survival as well. Because we're after more than ingenuity, otherwise our airport experience would be the place where everyone would want to worship. We want more. We want to be connected to the world in a more profound way. A few years ago, I was listening to National Public Radio to the show Fresh Air. You might be familiar with that. And Terry Gross, who was the host, was interviewing the Catholic writer and theologian John Dominic Crozon. And it was Easter time, and they were talking about the life of Jesus. And Crozon was describing the symbolic nature of Jesus' life. Are you saying the virgin birth is just a metaphor? Terry Gross asked. And you know that there's a kind of NPR laugh in someone's voice? Like, it's not an out laugh. It's just a kind of undercurrent of a laugh. Are you saying it's just a metaphor? And I inferred that she was hoping to separate the literal from the figurative. And Crozon thought for a moment and agreed that it was indeed a metaphor, but not just a metaphor. The modifier that she had chosen for metaphor, he said, is the most powerful tool that humans have. I thought it was brilliant that he could think of that answer that quickly after she said it and just separate the just out of it. Metaphor is our way of seeing when we are creative. We are joining things together in a way that didn't exist before. We are making one thing out of two or three things. Metaphor can elevate us and take our breath away. The etymology of metaphor is from metaphora, to transfer, which is literally a carrying over, and from meta, over and across, to feren, to bear. And when you're working with materials, there's an implicit metaphor in the transformation of materials, how one pattern joins another to become a third. It's a symbol, too, for our own transformation. Looking at quilts, there is, for me, a transformation that is both fragile and strong and can be extended to all the various elements of our lives, how they are stitched and patched together to make who we are, and a surprising beauty at the combination of the parts that makes the whole out of who we have become. And to extend looking at metaphor, this carrying over is also the way the maker connects with the past, that in every new piece we make, we are bringing along the makers of the past with us, having a conversation, editing, transforming. What makes the making of craft so compelling to people is at the same time it's telling a new story, it's telling an ancient one as well. It's telling the story of ingenuity and adaptation in physical and spiritual survival. Within our ingenious way of making, there are technical skills, how we make things. But to begin the spiritual journey of making, we need to find the place to create. At the still point T.S. Eliot wrote, as I'm sure you remember from college, there the dance is. And that's what we're looking for. That place where we can move easily between dreams, desire, fear, and hope, and be moving with something that's unnameable at the same time. And so amid this world of cell phones and credit cards, 24-hour news cycles, Dr. John's lingerie and novelty shop, silly and sillier TV, suicide bombers, too much patriotism, and too little compassion, we have to find the silent space to begin our creative journey. As with our ingenious techniques, where one response to the material may lead to another unexpected response, we must be ready for whatever comes our way. We must have a sense of where we are going, a vision of where we think we'll end up. But once we go inside the work and inside ourselves, we have to be ready to give up what we thought we knew and look for what is there. This is a difficult part of the journey, since there's some faith involved in moving in this silent space and trying something we've never tried. But that's the space we must enter when we create. Our work comes alive when we surprise ourselves, as Robert Frost writes in his essay, The Figure a Poem Makes. No surprise for the writer, no surprise for the reader. The work will always be empty, will always be surface and technique if we don't dig deeply. This part of making is the spiritual quest, because we enter into the unknown and come out changed. When we're in this moment of making, we're living in slow time, a silent time. Creativity comes out of the silence when we are listening to more than ourselves. We are listening to the materials we work with. We are listening to the sound of our own breath. And in that silence, the work is born. After we go through this quest to make our work, after we use our human ingenuity and dig deep within ourselves to discover what we need to say, then we re-enter the world. And our world has names for things, and people working in craft media have lately, you may have noticed, become obsessed with how we name things. Is it art or is it craft? Are we artists? Are we craftspeople? Craftsmen? Craftswomen? Craftsmakers? Are we makers? Are we making pots or are we making vessels? Are we making fiber art or are we making quilts? Are we quilt artists? Are we makers of art who are using quilts to reference our heritage? Museums change their names. The Museum of American Craft Museum, a sensible name, recently changed its name to the Museum of Art and Design, which is a wonderful acronym. It's MAD. Did you know? I mean, you couldn't ask for a better irony than that, I think. But all in all, it's important to name things because that's how you know you can say your name. I can say my name. You know that Maine's a place and Nebraska's a place, and there's a wonderful heritage to that. I think we can also make ourselves a little bit silly with naming things and naming our work in that way. And it reminds me of beginning rock bands who can spend so much time trying to think of the best name for their group. And I think it's better to practice and make the best music rather than worry about appearances. The Beatles certainly is not the most stellar name for a band, but it looks like it didn't really make a difference to them. Galleries have ways of looking at art, as do schools and museums. I was reminded of that this morning at the panel discussion that I attended here. And you know, there are two versions to the golden rule. The one from the Bible, do unto others as the whole congregation? Yeah. But the other version of it is the one where the gold makes all the rules. You may have heard that one. Anyhow, so galleries have ways of looking at art, and schools have ways of looking at art, and museums have ways of looking at art. And I saw the Gee's Bend quilt show at the Whitney Museum when it was there, and I didn't go into the museum to see the Gee's Bend show. I was in New York, and I had time to go to a museum, so I went to the Whitney. So I had no expectations at all. And it to me was the most astounding thing to see the show. I realized that there's some views about how it's marketed and other things, but just to see that work on the wall, the feeling of the power of it was so palpable, and the people's engagement at seeing it in that space. And then I finished that, and I went up another floor of the Whitney, and there was 20th century American art, which was also great. And, but I just thought then, I just couldn't help but wonder, well, who's in charge here? Like, who gets to say who gets to be where in this building, or who gets to be in this building, and who gets to say what's important or valuable? For me, I find it best just to recognize that incredible irony, that there's the creation of art, then there's the structure, the hierarchy, and the various vested interests that surround it. If you are a maker, the best you can do is make the work. Don't try to call it what it's not to reach another audience which may not care about you anyway. Make the best work and have it stand by itself. Make the work that calls on all the makers of the past, the heritage and traditions of the past, and carries us into the future as well. No work should stand still. Our traditions guide us to the point of the work we are making now, but we can't hold a tradition in one place. It's meant to change as we change. Like a family, it should anchor us and allow us to grow at the same time. And like a family, when it's time for your children to leave home, then it's time to watch them make their own way into the world, knowing that whatever you planted within them is still there, but it will blossom in its own way. Why are we making work? This may be the kind of question you ask yourself in the middle of the night, or when you turn off the lights to your studio, or when you're stuck in an airport for an extended stay, I guess, as well. It's a struggle that we may get used to, but our struggle must be about more than ourselves and our work. We might be going on a journey ourselves, but the work has to go beyond us. In Judaism, there's a phrase, Tikkun Olam, and that means literally to repair the world. And the concept behind it is that as humans, it's our obligation on earth to repair this broken world. What better group to consider this idea of people who can sew, people, because this mending is what we need to be about. And it's not just about mending yourself, it's showing others that the world can be mended. We can use old technologies, new technologies, we can use tradition, and we can use innovation. But we need to make work that can unite us to our past and carry us into the future as well. We need to make work that carries hope inside of it, not a naive hope, but a hope based on our ability to figure things out and our willingness to ask questions whose answers we don't know. That's the end of the first part of my talk. And now, Michael, will you lock the doors? Thank you. You know, for a poet in America, how many quilters are there? 27 million? There are probably millions of poets, but for a poet to have an audience this large is an astounding thing in America. That's right, Ted Kooser, the wonderful past poet laureate, who's also been to Haystack as a visiting writer. So this is kind of take two. I'm going to read you 7 poems that I think kind of get at what I just tried to get at one way. I'm going to try to get at another. And I think when you begin to make work, that making is a kind of, I think every time you make work, it's kind of a prayer in a way. And I began to think about that and have a new book will be out soon called Prayers and Run-On Sentences. Began to write prayers that were kind of run-on sentences. If you know a run-on sentence, what you were supposed to avoid in your youth. as a kind of breathless way of looking at the world. And this poem is called Prayer. Our problem, may I include you, is that we don't know how to start, how to just close our eyes and let something dance between our hearts and our lips. We don't know how to skip across the room only for the joy of the leap. We walk, we run, but what happened to the skip and its partner, the gallop, the useless and imaginary way we could move through space, the horses we rode before we knew how to saddle up, before we had opinions about everything and just loved the wind in our faces and the horizon in our eyes. This next one's called Prayer in the Strip Mall, Bangor, Maine. Religion can happen anywhere. The day after Thanksgiving and the stores are decked out for holiday shopping, including a TJ Maxx, where what was once too expensive loses its value and attracts us. There's a store with a big yellow banner proclaiming giant book sale, a seasonal operation of remaindered books, which doesn't mean that the books aren't good, only that the great machinery of merchandising didn't engage its gears in quite the right way. And I buy 2 books of poetry and am leaving the store, the first snowstorm of winter on the way, and as I get to the glass double doors, a bearded man with a cane is entering. He has been walking with a woman who is continuing on to another store, and he has a look that can make him either eccentrically brilliant or just plain simple. And as I open the door and he opens the other side, he turns and says, "I love you." Not to me, but calling back to his friend who is departing, only he said it looking at me, closest to me, which is unintended love, random love, love that should be spread throughout the world, shouted in our ears for free. This next poem is kind of a guy poem, and I thought it would be appropriate in terms of just sharing information with you. And it also deals with, you've noticed the gender imbalance, slight gender imbalance. Here, I take it. And it also, I think, it really grows out of this idea of technology and ingenuity, human ingenuity. It's called Urinals. When I went on a tour of the Kohler factory, I walked into a 19th century industrial room that was full of urinals, unfired and smelling like the damp earth, the scent that fills the memories of potters throughout time, and saw one after another of this most humble of objects, unglazed and gray, an elegant shape still without function, the curved back that no one ever sees when it is mounted on a tiled wall of the airport or movie theater. But now I never look at these vessels the same way as I take aim wherever commerce is, wherever travelers go. The urinal, where I can shred a cigarette butt or disintegrate a disinfectant disc. In so many models, the trough, the down to the floor, low to the ground for kids, automatic flusher, all these vessels that carry our water in the public restroom, millions of flushes, men sending cups of coffee, morning juice, wine and beer, and all those illusions. As we stand in a trance, staring at the glazed surface, a moment without time, holding onto our penises, thinking, is this what I was meant to be? Pouring ourselves into this simple vessel that holds beauty you can't see, that once smelled like the earth and was transformed by fire, that knows what it's there for and therefore knows what it is. And if you want to see what they look like, it's just right there. There's one downstairs. I think there are actually 3 downstairs. And if you ever have a chance to go to the Kohler factory in Wisconsin, they have a wonderful arts and industry program. It's an amazing resource. And so this next poem is called Sabbath, and it's thinking about this idea of like the silence behind what we do. I want to make this pilgrimage every week. After we have kindled the Sabbath candles, walk away from the house and stand in the back field, away from the roads, light, and traffic, so that the stars become brighter and we can look at our own house for what it is, a shelter from the wilderness that surrounds us. The ancient light of the Milky Way and the steady beating of the wind, rattling ash and spruce. Endless wind, endless night, a harmony so frightening we head back into the house, pretending to be cold. Could we add a minute each time to what we can bear, so that years from now we will still stand there all night in the slow circling of heaven, the dipper emptying itself, the fox and deer brushing against us as they make their rounds. And I have 2 more poems to read. One's a little longer, and it's from a series of poems that I've been writing based on artwork that I have. People have given me, and This is about a guitar that was made by Bobby Hansen, who's a metalsmith who works in tin and found objects. And he had found an old film canister, like it must be 16 millimeter films, so metal canister, and a neck of an Epiphone guitar, which he said he used to live in a neighborhood where at the end of every weekend he could just go walk around and he'd always see broken ones in the garbage because there'd be a lot going on over the weekends, I guess. And he put those together to make a guitar, and then he gave the guitar to me. So it's a wonderful object that he also ornamented with other. He riveted on different pieces of metal as well. So it's become my kind of, this is an ars poetica, like the reason I write. We all make things, but sometimes what we are doing is making things obvious or too obvious. We want to make things obvious enough. You want to take the neck of an Epiphone guitar and add a 16 millimeter film canister and strings, and all of a sudden you're making music. You want to find the one thing and add it to another. You want to look in the trash can to find out what's been lost and then introduce it to your old friends, words, sounds, and dreams, and see if they can make a marriage. Your artistic life is dating all the time, trying to imagine itself in love, or at least living together for a while, trying to imagine a life inside an apartment and what every morning is like, drinking coffee and looking out the window. I don't know where the muses are. I did see them on top of a theater in Mexico once, but I think there is something calling out from the broken necks of old guitars, from the fragments of a label that could say icy or spicy, or the rivets that you can use to join things together to make something instrumental. We are building and interpreting. We write the poem and wait to see if it sings. Like if you hum the right note, everything in the room that can will vibrate with it. The piano, the glasses, and the pipes. A harmony made out of the unexpected and the disregarded, like Emma Lazarus, who is calling to all objects, like Jesus is on the mount, asking for the poor, the downtrodden, the forgotten, and the discarded. This is where the new life comes from: metal, wood, breath, and sound. The imagination is in the thing itself. It's imagining its own life, making its own communion, breaking bread with the world, embracing what's left us. The imagination is plucking on the taut strings of today. It's putting its fingers down on the old fretboard. It's making a sound that's traveling, circling the ear, the nautilus chamber, entering into the tiny bones that vibrate against your skull. It's waiting to see if someone is listening. That's the sound to wait for. And the last poem I wanted to read you, then we'll unlock the doors, you can eat lunch. You do make poems out of your own experience, like you make art out of your own experience, I guess. And on those beautiful rocks that Michael showed you before, on the beautiful coast of Maine, I was taking a beautiful walk, and I jumped down onto a beautiful rock, and my beautiful feet slipped out from under me, and I hit my beautiful face right against a beautiful rock and fractured my cheek. It was pretty bad. And then I came up with my face all bloody. I wasn't going to tell this, but I'm in it already, like this. And it was the first day of a session. Somebody thought I was staging a first aid drill, so they'd know what to do. Anyhow, a little while later, I got a poem out of it, so I think it's pretty good. Other than that, it's worked out okay. It's called "The Body Remembers." I slip on the rocks at low tide, floating for a timeless moment over the skeletons of shells, the fields of barnacles, until my face meets the granite and my cheek and eye grow numb and turn blue and black as my body sets about to heal the damaged tissue, the broken bone. To think that all this is programmed inside me, never called on until this moment of swelling and bleeding. My body, my faithful companion, my inside out, my outside in, repairs itself while I sit on top of it like some incompetent ruler whose aides know how to take care of all the details. My body mends itself like a fisherman at his nets, like my mother-in-law darning socks. Our job on earth is to repair the broken and bruised world. We fix from within, we pull into the garage of the soul and put ourselves on the lift, take out the wrenches and grease gun, and get to work. Oh, miraculous recovery, or what we don't know that blesses us. Thank you.